in Mark's Gospel, there are several passages, well, not a lot of passages, but several passages that are quite lengthy. Chapter 5 and chapter 15 are both very lengthy chapters in his Gospel. The story I'm about to read to you today is a very long story, a very long pericope, as we call them in sermon jargon. And so I'm reading to you now the full story from the latter half of Mark's chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, referring to the Sea of Galilee, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, he fell at Jesus' feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and she had endured much under many physicians, and had spent all of that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about at the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd that is pressing in on you? How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." Well, while he was still talking to her, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter's dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Don't be afraid, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered the house, he said to them, "Why do you make such a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Well, they laughed at him. And he put them out of the house, and he took the child's father and the mother, and those who were with him, Peter, James, and John, and he went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the little girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12. At this, they were overcome with amazement. Thus ends the reading of the word. You know, a good deal of the miraculous healing of women in the Hebrew scriptures, that's the Old Testament, was specific to their barrenness. You know, that is their inability to have children, preferably male children, who were the gender-specific heirs to their father's property. Sarah, Isaac's mother, the wives and slave girls of Abimelech, Manoah, Samson's mother, Hannah, Samuel's mother, and the Shunammite woman were all healed of their barrenness. In the case of the Shunammite woman, when her boy died, Elisha, who had made sure she had the boy, now happened by and decided, well, since her boy is dead, I guess I'll raise her. Well, maybe he didn't do it that way, but anyway, Elijah happened by and he raised the boy from the dead. Only Miriam, Moses' sister, was said to have been healed of an illness, of leprosy, through the intervention of Moses. As we have already seen in Mark's Gospel, Jesus has demonstrated healing powers akin to Moses, Elijah, and Elisha. Mark tells us that he has been healing people since his very first day on the job. People from all over town were queuing up to the front door of Peter's mother-in-law's house, and Jesus was healing them of their diseases and ridding them of demons. When he decided to take the good news proclamation on the road, people followed him and sought him out in the streets. They came from miles away to ask for his help. In today's story, Jesus is approached by the head of the synagogue. That in Greek is called the Archi-Synagogus. Archi-Synagogus. His name, thank God, is Jairus. And it was Jairus' duty as the head of the synagogue. It was his duty, are you ready for this, to select the readers, the teachers in the synagogue. It was his duty to examine the discourses of the public speakers. It was his duty to see to it that all things were done with decency and in accordance with the ancestral usage. In short, Jairus held very high status, not only in the synagogue, but also in the community, as one who approves or disapproves of teachers and preachers. He's sort of a one-man board of ordinations. Jairus sought out Jesus, the healer. The public figure of high standing in front of God and everybody fell at Jesus' feet and begged him over and over and over again, not just once, but repeatedly. My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. Please, if you would, take a moment to picture the scene that Mark has painted here. Look around you in your imagination at the stunned faces of the people who see this man of stature and high place on the ground, head bowed before Jesus. A man who can boast no credentials, particularly, other than the trail of healings that he's left in his wake. Jesus says nothing, according to the text. He just goes with Jairus immediately in the direction of his house. Because of what they have witnessed, the ever-curious crowd follow the two men, and they are pressing in around them, perhaps to hear their conversation or just to be in the presence of these two extraordinary men. Perhaps they were moved by the fact that Jairus' position and stature in the community did not make him immune to suffering, grief, pain, or injury. The pace of the two men is urgent, and Jairus is beside himself with worry. He's likely recounting the story of the course of his daughter's illness to Jesus when suddenly Mark presses the literary pause button and suddenly inserts another character with another story and another problem into the story. She stops everything. This woman in the crowd carries no stature, no standing to match that of Jairus. As a matter of fact, she is a woman shunned and avoided because she is sickly, made unclean by untapped and repeated hemorrhages. Leviticus 15 reads this way: when a woman has a discharge of blood that is her regular discharge from her body, she shall be in her impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. Everything upon which she lies during her impurity shall be unclean. Everything also upon which she sits shall be unclean. If a woman has a discharge of blood for many days, not at the time of her impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond the time of her impurity, for all of the days of the discharge she shall continue in uncleanness as the days of her impurity. She shall be unclean. Mark tells us that this woman in the crowd has been suffering her affliction, her uncleanness for 12 years. She has spent every penny she had on physicians and their treatments. The treatments themselves caused considerable suffering and did not cure her condition, but rather made her condition worse. One might wonder if Jairus knows her. The crowd that is following after Jesus, and Jairus includes Jesus' disciples, all are pressing in around Jesus. Mark tells us that this unnamed hemorrhaging woman has heard about Jesus. We will assume that she is aware Jesus is on an urgent errand to save a child, the daughter of an important man. The sense of her story is not to want to interrupt or impede the progress of Jesus and his entourage. She believes that if she can just connect with the hem of Jesus' garment, a bit of his healing power will flow into her. Now, her way of thinking is very different. As a matter of fact, it's ludicrous. Jesus has to bestow the healing. Well, that is what we've witnessed from the start of Mark's gospel, isn't it? Jesus speaks out demons. Jesus touches away the sickness. If people could be healed by touching Jesus' garments, then he could take off his clothes, hang them on a hook, and take a nap. While people queued up to touch his clothes, the account of the woman with the hemorrhage is not a testament to the power of Jesus' clothes. It is a testament to the power of this woman's faith. Amen. She invests her heart and her soul, her entire being, in this single moment of faith. She is intent on not disturbing the holy man on his most important journey. She will not ask him to stop for her, just like all those in the crowd pressing in on him, touching him. She will just brush against his clothes. But her touch stands out in the crowd. Her touch is a stop-action touch. Her touch literally stops Jesus in his tracks. She felt certain he wouldn't notice, but the faith that was in her touch was itself so powerful that Jesus responded. Her touch was fueled by persistence, determination, risk, and daring. Not a passive recipient of healing, but an active participant, boldly reaching out for someone, for something beyond frustration and beyond despair. Immediately, writes Mark, immediately her hemorrhage stopped. After this verse of the gospel story are verses of total chaos, chaotic crowd reaction. Jesus has his growing entourage of disciples, the anxious father of the dying girl, and the crowd stop. Jesus has felt power go out of him, and he is surprised by it. Who touched me? He asks. The response from all around him is mixed. Jairus has no time to waste, and the disciples are scratching their heads, as they do a lot. Because everyone has been touching him all along the way. The disciples dismiss the profundity of Jesus' experience, asking, how can you even ask that of an individual who might have drawn healing from him. At last, the lone woman steps forward, believing that she, rather than triumphing over her disease, has sinned. She comes forward to Jesus in fear and trembling and kneels before him, humbling herself, confessing her offense, telling him the whole truth. That, by the way, is a saga of 12 years. And Jesus listens, while the crowd, the disciples, and Jairus are likely tapping their watches. When she finishes her story, Jesus has not only been a witness to her phenomenal faith, he has been touched by it. Daughter, your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and live healed of your disease. Who is to say that this woman, now made whole and well, did not follow Jesus and become one of the women disciples of Jesus who followed him all the way to Jerusalem from Galilee. As Jesus finishes his blessing of the woman healed, messengers arrive from Jairus' house to tell him that they are all too late. Jairus' daughter is dead. The representatives with the news say, don't trouble the teacher anymore. Don't trouble him any further. They're saying there's no need for the healer to come now. Has she died, we ask, because of the holdup? Is someone to blame for this? Jesus' response is to turn to Jairus, saying, don't be afraid. Only believe. Jesus himself has just witnessed faith like none other he has ever seen. He is encouraging Jairus to believe as the woman with the hemorrhage believed, to be determined, to be persistent, to take a risk, to be bold in faith. Perhaps for greater ease and swiftness of movement, Jesus told the crowd and his disciples, except for Peter, James, and John, to stay behind while he went on to Jairus' house. He encountered much weeping and wailing, and he asked why the weepers and the wailers were making such a commotion in the house. Were they trying to wake the child who he said was only sleeping? When they laughed at him for his ignorance, he threw them out of the house. He went with Jairus and Jairus' wife and his 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, into the child's room. And he took her by the hand and he said, little girl, get up, and she did. Jesus had 5 faithful companions in that room with him, 4 of whom had just witnessed the incredible healing faith of one obscure woman moments before arriving at Jairus' house. The child's room was charged with that lingering wonder, that positive energy, that faith energy of these individuals who had seen something extraordinary and had a whole new perspective on what's possible. Their faith in the power and presence of Jesus was integral to this moment of resurrection. Peter, James, and John had witnessed the resurrection of a child from the dead today. Jesus is now in the same league with the prophet Elisha, who raised the Shunammite woman's son from the dead. Certainly, the healings of a woman and a girl today are unique in the scriptural annals of healing. Jesus will continue to be compared with the great prophets and the holy men of the past until at last he does something so extraordinary that there is no one left who can compare with him.